Oh God, as we find ourselves in this place, what we ask is for a couple things. One, that you will aid and help us in centering ourselves this morning, regardless of what's going on in the world around us or even what's going on in our world. If there is a way that this could be a respite or a Sabbath experience, that we find ourselves communing with you and communing with other people in this discipline of study, that's what we hope for. So help us to do that, to fully engage in the time here, and at the same time, we know in order for that to happen, we're mindful of the different burdens that are on our corner and the burdens that seem to show up on every corner. We do want to pray for them, and if there's a way of giving them to you, that seems to be a phrase that we use often, so that we can fully engage in the moments that we have here, then we pray for that. We pray for those that are in the hospital, those that are grieving. We pray for those that are facing all types of things, from cancer treatments and battles that have to do with physical bodies. We pray for those that are hurting relationally or emotionally, where the concept of breathing is almost too much. In all of this, for ourselves and for those that we love and care about, and even for those that we don't know, who are hurting, what we believe is that part of your will is that you have reconciled the world unto yourself for the purpose of all of creation, anything that fits inside of the created order, to be redeemed. And so we pray for that. Maybe a better way of saying it or expressing it is, God, your kingdom come here on earth, in our life, in our world, as it is in heaven. So we pray for all these things, and we ask it in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, so we're in chapter 9. We did meet last week, so it's got to go back a couple of weeks ago when we started chapter 9. So sort of to give us to familiarize ourselves with it again, there's always been this concept inside the Corinth church, and it shows up really from day one, or at least in chapter 1 for us, about their status, how they see themselves. And some of them view themselves or perceive themselves to be, if there is a hierarchy of people, they are on the higher end of that. Some of it was tied to socioeconomic issues, but a great deal of it was tied to their personal theology. And the idea was that this is how they saw themselves. They had received Christ, and because they have received Christ, they were given special knowledge compared to just the average person. And because of their specialness, that put them in a place closer to God, at least how they saw themselves. And so because you are closer to God, they then made some conclusions that there were some things that they could do that others could not, or there were some things that they shouldn't do, and those that did do it, whether it be right or wrong, that was proof that they were lesser than. And so Paul, in pretty much showing up in chapter 7 and chapter 8, and then in chapter 9 is where he really nails down this argument over a couple of chapters, is what someone can do, what someone can't do. And the phrase that shows up, it's a Corinthian phrase, is that all things might be lawful, which means they're okay, but if they're not beneficial, then you don't do it out of respect and out of love for the greater whole or the benefit of the church. Because what these people were doing, and we're concluding that he's mainly talking to the leaders, a smaller group, maybe not to the whole masses, but that's more of my understanding. You can find other commentaries who would say he's talking to the masses of the church. But whoever the audience is, what some were doing was they were then taking their view of specialness and then either distancing themselves from the group or either forcing certain teachings and thoughts upon the group And Paul takes issue with those because instead of unifying the church, instead of glorifying God, building the church up, it's actually destroying the church. Now you're really going to see this same larger thought come into play when we leave this chapter 9, 10, and we go into chapter 12 and 13 and 14, where you talk about gifts and how they play out inside of the community. It's very clear of what's the most important thing for how the church operates, and that is to build up the whole and to glorify God in the process. So we really can't get away from this whole concept of something might be lawful for the believer, which means it is okay, you're not breaking God's law, but if it's not beneficial, then you out of the humility principle comes into play. And in this case, it wasn't happening. And so in 9, Paul tweaks the argument. Remember, this is going on for a couple of chapters. In 9, he is dealing with, he's using himself as now the example of what it would look like if you want to see it in the flesh, of where all things might be lawful, but all things not beneficial. And so when it's not beneficial, to take the higher ground, or to take to be humble and to not do it. And he uses his life as an example of that. And so we talked last week about how the first part of chapter 9 has to deal with support, how certain ministers or speakers or philosophers supported themselves. And Paul is talking about how he's lower on the scale, number 4, more so than number 1 or number 2. And so he sees this as, he's doing it a better way because he's not hurting anybody or not requiring aid from other people compared to some of the people of that day who spoke for a living. And so we talked a little bit about that. And then he also in the first part of chapter 9 defends himself and his resume as an apostle compared to some of the other speakers that are floating around the Corinth area that did not. And so there's a way that Paul is defending what his practice is over the practice of what's going on inside of the local church. And so his argument tweaks a little bit when we get into verse 8 and we start talking about offerings and things of that nature. He's going back to an Old Testament analogy of how even priests would receive income and what that looked like, and it all came through the sacrificial system. And there were certain formulas set up where if you made this type of offering, X amount would go to you, X amount would stay on the altar to be burned up or to be consumed. That would be offered to God, and then some of it would go to the priests, or at least go to the priestly family. And he just kind of goes through all those. And so now we get into verse 15. And so if somebody would read verse 15 through, would someone be so bold as to read 15 to 23? That would be the best thing for us. All right, thank you. So we get into this whole idea of where, again, he's using his own life, and particularly around the issue of, again, what could be his in the form of right, or could be him in the form of it being lawful, but going and taking a different pattern for the sake of something greater. And now specifically, this has to deal with him and, the idea of, as a minister, getting paid and what that would look like. Did we ever talk about the history of professional ministry? Does that ring a bell? Maybe. Well, just that, we're in a season, and when this is going on for a few hundred years, so it's not like when I say a season, don't think months or just maybe a year or two. But, the way churches are set up now, it's heavily, like St. Paul's a good example. We have professional ministers, professional clergy, myself, John, and we have professional staff, Grace, Aaron, things of that nature. That hadn't always been the case. Obviously it's not the case in the early church at all. Now, ministers, there was compensation to some degree, but it's not on the same level. One, because churches were small. This is startup type, in the book of Acts. But when we move into the 300s, Constantine is the Roman emperor. He blesses Christianity as the religion. Up until then, from around the beginning of the book of Acts until 3, I think there's the edict that goes out in 305 or 318. Don't hold me to that. But it's early 300. And up until then, Christianity wasn't even recognized as a practicable religion. Partly because they saw it as a subset of Judaism, and Judaism was on the list. And the way the Roman government operated is that you had an official emperor religion, but it wasn't really enforced. Now, one of the things that show up in the book of Revelation is that it's starting to get enforced with a different emperor, and so now everybody's wondering what that's going to be like. But there were always temples inside the Roman government, or inside the Roman Empire, for emperor worship. And as long as you would go and drop your 2 cents in the little box and kind of do a token prayer maybe once a year or something, it was okay. You could practice whatever religion you wanted, as long as it did not invoke a riot. The two things that the Roman Empire valued more than anything else was taxes and peace. And so as long as your religion did not threaten those two things, which meant that you paid your taxes like a good citizen, and you did not revolt against the empire, you could practice pretty much whatever you wanted. Specifically, if your religion was on the list and you couldn't be arrested. If it wasn't on the list and you practiced, it was kind of don't ask, don't tell type stuff. And depending on what the emperor would be, if the emperor wanted to enforce something, or if there was an emperor that because there's seasons of persecution for Christians. They weren't always persecuted under the Roman Empire. They're persecuted around the 50s AD, and then there's a season where there's not. There's a new emperor that comes on. He does not persecute. Then eventually he dies, and the next one comes in. He does. It's kind of hit or miss on when persecution would take place. And but they really wouldn't persecute someone whose religion was on the list. You had a free pass to worship as long as you paid your taxes and you didn't start a riot. But in early, I think it's around 305, Christianity is added to the list. And then around maybe 318 or through 320, they become the official religion. And so, so when you get 325, you have the first or the second major council. First council shows up in Acts chapter 15. But, where all the bishops come together, and you have the Nicene Creed is one of the results that comes out of this in 325. You really get the rise of professional ministers there. And so that goes well, and obviously until the Roman Empire is overthrown. And then you have just sort of, hit or miss for a while, Dark Ages, and you still have some professional clergy through the role of priest, and then that kind of evolves a little bit, and you get to 1500s, and then you have, of course, Protestant Catholic split, and you have some professional ministers that are more like college professors. The religion was taught in the universities, and so they would teach theology and then also maybe teach rhetoric or something like that along with it. But around the 1800s is when, of course, by then you've got churches all over the place. That they're not just big cathedrals like in a city. You've got just a huge population and a huge push of evangelism. And so you get, even like in Columbus. I mean, how many churches are in Columbus? You want to take a stab at it? I mean, a ton. And and not all of them have professional clergy. A number of them do not because of their size. They just can't afford it, for lack of better words. And so you have bivocational ministers and whatnot. But the mainline denominations pretty much have. We live in a time of professional ministers.
Don't you think, though, that as a minister, it is a profession, but it's not more than that. It's like being a professional military person or policeman.
Right.
It's more than a profession.
Sure. Well, that's kind of that's a perfect segue. Thank you. You don't have to pay attention for the rest of the day because you nailed it, and that's exactly where we were going. So first A of the class goes to Pat. So what do we do when that happens? I mean, and I want to first talk about it. We'll use me as the example, professional clergy. Is it a job? All right, and if it is, should myself or John get paid? What Paul is getting at this whole idea that that I'm going to interpret as professional minister for today's conversation. If that is the way our system is set up, the way our church, not just St. Paul, but just for the most part, the church today operates inside the U.S. Is it a job? Is it a calling? Is there a difference between the two? If it is, what is that difference? Is it first a calling and then a job, or because we're in a day now where the tide, at least in the mainline denominations, which would be Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal, all that, we're in Catholic as well. The pool of professional ministers is getting smaller. Years ago, it wasn't. You could have. St. Paul at one time, 10 years ago, had 5 ministers or 4.5. Yeah, no, it's not that. Yes, not too long. Part of it is recession. At least in the Methodist Church, our conference in 2009, 8, 9, and 10. On salary support, now you can put benefits as well in this, we lost almost $1 million a year just in South Georgia. And it's just because the giving went down. Go back and think of what it was like back in 2008 and 2009 where you turn on the TV and all of a sudden the stock market loses 1,000 points in one day. And then they go up 500 points at the beginning of the next day's opening, and then by lunch they've lost 300 of that. How many of you watch those TVs watch the TV where, you're wondering before what was the 20 banks? What was it called? They got what was the bailout called? It had anyway. Before the bailout, how many of you own bank stocks? It's okay. Nobody's watching. We're not filming you, all right? So. What was that like? Or GE? How many of you own some mainline, good old blue chip American companies? And Aflac went from 50 to 9 in 2 days. Remember that? I just remember, just dying, and then GE went down to $5.90. Just bank stocks. Synovus went down to 90 cents or something. So it's, I mean, it's just all kind, and that happened within, some of it happened within months. Some of it happened within a year. And so, you can imagine, I mean, we don't want to imagine it because we're trying to get rid of it. We psychologically, emotionally, we've been 4 years removed, and so we're starting to feel better. So, I don't want to go back and cause you pain. I mean, I want to go back and visit that because I remember watching that going, oh, I'm never going to be able to retire now. And, so there was a ton of resources taken out of the church. Benefit, part of that was salary, part of it was insurance, part of it was pension. That's in the Methodist church. Now, inside the other church, just as much. And so, there was a huge money crunch. On top of that, so the supply went down. Some people went to parachurch ministries. Some people just retired and got out and checked out. And we have not, on the Methodist church, gotten back up to a level where, that we're, where there's a giant pool of supply. South Georgia, our conference, has managed that very well. Some other conferences have not. Some other conferences are heavy undersupplied. Some of them are heavy oversupplied. And so we're all just still trying to fill our way through all this. But one of the negative outcomes of all of this is now the pool for professional clergy has gotten smaller. There are less people going into the ministry today than earlier times.
But you said there are way more churches.
Well, they are. So then let's do the math on that. So I'm talking about full-time funded clergy, and so now since there are a number of churches that are still there, then clergy have done bivocational, type ministries where they might have a job that's, their normal job, and then on Sundays they give their time and things of that nature. But on the, the full-time, the full-time clergy person, the full-time minister, that pool has gotten a great deal smaller because of just, the pipeline is not what it used to be. And part of that is when you have professional clergy, there's education requirements, which is a good thing. I mean, and for the Methodist Church, and probably the same for, I think, the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterians, they require a master's level just as the entry point. And so you've got people that who end up going to college. You got to get your bachelor's first, and you got to go get your master's. So a lot of it is a financial issue. And we've also discovered that the average age of the person going into the ministry now is upward of 45 years old.
So that they've already had my career.
Right. And part of that is my generation, Gen X. The predictions for Gen Xers is not just that they'll have 5 different jobs by the time they reach retirement age. They'll have 5 different careers. And so, I mean, you can think about how many people might have been trained, in one level of education, and now their job doesn't look anything like that. And so that'll happen. That process of change is going to continue for a while. Most people think that'll happen for another couple of generations, and then we'll go back to what it was years ago, where you're trained and people stay there. There'll be some level of resetting of the bar.
I don't think that's totally bad.
No, I'm not predicting dire. This isn't, it's now the issue for us, like inside the church for professional clergy. Now, bivocationals, take them out of the argument, all right? Because if you don't need means of living and support, then you can do whatever you need to do. But if the average age of the mainline person going into the ministry today is 45 and older, and they still got to have a 3-year master's in theology or something like that, divinity degree, I mean, how many people can do that at age 45? Most of them have kids, have established families, things of that nature, so there's a cost. And so what that's done is that has forced theological education to change. So now you have a lot that takes place online, but I don't know if you've ever done any online classes or study. There's something that you miss by not being in the classroom and not being a residential student. So so that has some pitfalls that show up. It's easier, financially better. It's easier to get the education done, But there's some pitfalls that come with that when it comes to, hands-on in ministry. But if you go the route of where you're a resident, then, that's 3 years, uproot your family to, move to Atlanta, move to Lexington, Wilmore, move to Duke, Vandy, things of that nature, SMU. That's just Methodist schools. There are others. And so it's not, now we got all these issues that are in the frying pan of what do we do. And so anyways, gosh, boy, that was a rabbit trail, wasn't it? Yes, ma'am.
Has the Bible Belt shrunk as much as the rest of the country?
As in losing members in churches? No, not really. I mean, it has declined, but out west has lost the most, northeast second, and the south, has been in decline in mainline denominations. What we don't have good statistical data on is home churches, new startups, non-denominational churches. They're on the rise, but they don't count. And so, and then if they do count, they count locally. They don't send it to any body that then could pass the information on. And so my guess is that not that we, whenever you hear these numbers of, and I try not to do this, I don't want to say, oh, the church has been in decline by X percentage over X amount of time. That's a half truth. The main lines are, but we don't know what's happening over here on all these new churches that have started, because we're starting more churches now than we have in a long time. But they're not connected to, the majority of them are not connected to a mainline denomination, and they're growing. So I think what you're having is just a reshuffling of the deck chairs, for lack of better words.
What do you think the age was, the average age was when like Buddy Cooper went
To seminary?
hadn't been that long?
22.
Gosh, it really was.
Yeah, I mean, they go to college. They start to some form, maybe serving as a youth director or something like that. And as soon as they graduate college, they might take a year off or a summer, and they start graduate school. And most of them are seminaries are set up to where, at least the majority of them, where you go while you're studying as a resident, you're forced into different ministries. You might be a year in a pastoral setting, a year in a clinical setting. Part of it is to fill out and to see where your giftedness lies. That's the next part of this. It's not just a money issue or support issue. It's where do the gifts lie. On top of this is another thing that adds something else into this. Because of, I think I've introduced some books to you like Unchristian. If y'all were here and you did that's Gabe Lyons and Dave Kinnaman, and they both wrote some follow-up books, Where Are They Now, or The Next Christians, or something like that. We've got some really good data on people who have come out of institutional churches, my generation, and it hadn't always been rosy. But yet they love God and they love Jesus. They just don't want to be a part of the institutional church. So and some of that you can see it. I mean, there's been the rise of parachurch ministries. I mean, you think about all the parachurch ministries that show up even inside of our, FCA, all right, Young Life. Just start naming a few. I mean, there are about 7 or 8 of them. And so now you got people who want to serve, and they do good, okay? This is not bad. This is some great stuff. They want to serve God, but they're loosely affiliated with the church, all right? And so, but, there's been some really smart and some bright people and some gifted people who have left, who probably 100 years ago would have found their way into pastoral ministry in some form or fashion. But now, you've got the parachurch whole organization and movement that's going there. And so that's been a pull away from the, like you're talking about Buddy and myself. John Few is the modern day person. He served in the church, parachurch for a while, served as a youth director for a while, went to seminary late in life. He was in maybe 35. I went right out of college. I mean, I went from high school to college. I took 9 months off, and I'd met Brooke, and we figured out if we were going to get married or not. And then I went up to Lexington for a year, and then I came back home, we got married, and then she moved to Lexington with me. So, I mean, I'm probably the last of, the majority of people in my generation. It's about 50-50 on who went in the traditional means or the historical way that's happened to maybe the way that John has done. Now, the majority is this. I mean, it's overwhelmingly this.
What do you think is the reason that they're running away from denomination? Is it the dues to the South Georgia?
Say the last thing. Well, I missed it.
The dues? Is it the amount of money you have to sit?
No, I mean, well, not necessarily. I think people are leaving institutional. The church has always been slow to change. I mean, for instance, say take the worship wars. Should we do traditional? Should we do contemporary? That started back in the 70s. I mean, or actually in the 60s. There are some pioneers that go back to, to use the common word, go back to the hippie whole experience. And for some of y'all can bring that back real easy, okay? So, I mean, you go back to that time period, and think about what was going on. We'll just use the U.S. Think about what was going on culturally inside the United States in that decade, okay? And so there were, there was a lot of people who were protesting everything. There were a lot of people, and some of them had no clue what they were even protesting. They just were protesting. All right. Yep. There's some. Yeah, they definitely did that too. There's some who were protesting. Of course, now they're doing it anyway. They passed a law for it. So, now and then there were some who knew exactly what they were protesting, and what got mapped into all of that was this social, religious. All that got mixed into one. Well, there were a couple of really smart pioneer people that noticed that there were a ton of people who would be classified in the category of hippie, and the church was not reaching them. And so they started contemporary worship. They took the music of the day. Listen, they're not the only ones. I mean, Martin Luther was famous for doing this. I mean, and I've told you guys, I think this, if not, I want to, A Mighty Fortress Is Our God, the tune to that is a bar tune. I'm dead serious. I mean, same with Wesley. Wesley would take the equivalent of lay speakers, and he would send them out to preach. You know where he sent them? To the bars. All right? And I mean, and there's a whole lineage of books and stories. They're called, I think they're called Wesley Heroes or Wesley, I don't know, some Wesley Warriors, something like that. But anyway, there are these first-hand accounts of these people, and they some of them were really rough, and they would go into a bar, and they would start preaching, and then some would like it, some would not. Well, then they'd go outside and they'd fight, and then they'd go back in and tell them that God loved them, And so, I mean, it's really interesting if you want to read some of this. But in every major evangelistic push, people find ways to make the gospel indigenous. And some of it's with music, some of it's with language, the translation of Bibles into original, whatever the language is of the culture. That always didn't happen. I mean, go back to your, Vatican I, Vatican II, go back to, I mean, Luther was one of the first to put the Bible in German. Up until then, it was still Latin. Latin came into force around the 400s. It exits early. And so for hundreds of years, the Mass was in Latin. The Scriptures were in Latin. Nobody spoke Latin but the priest. Nobody could read Latin but the priest. And so you just can't do that forever and expect for people to, actually learn, And so some of it is, there's a little bit of all that, and these people who reached out to this group, or this section of society that was not being reached, well, Maranatha, the whole, praise song, Maranatha, guess where that started? From a hippie. Bingo. One hippie trying to reach another hippie. All right? And so they started these types of musics, and then there are 3 or 4 others. Well, then that grows. Well, then you get into the 70s and 80s, and it starts to become a little bit more mainstream, and that's where it really hits the fan. Because you got, my grandmother who's sitting on the pew that thinks that God only comes when the organ plays, okay? And, and then you've got, maybe somebody else who says, well, I want to bring in this guitar, and so, I mean, you can see the church has always been slow to move. Changing a local church or even a denomination, whatever, is literally like turning the Titanic. It takes a long time to change culture. It takes a long time to change systems that have been in place for a long, just for a long time. And so some have said, I'm not waiting. And so they've left. And over, dress. All right, that's another issue. Well, some of y'all have been at St. Paul longer than me. I mean, even going to the whole camp meeting dress in the summer, where you don't have to wear a tie or a three-piece or something like that. Think about the progression of all that. Because I guarantee there was a time where women wore nothing but dresses. They wore hats. Everything. Yeah, I mean, and now, but gloves, everything. And hat, the whole 9 yards. And so, and then compare that to today. I mean, some of you didn't wear dresses Sunday. I saw it. I mean, and I've been taking notes, and I'm letting the bishop know, So I mean, there is a lot of that plays into it, and so the lesson that is for us to learn is what ultimately is the end game. All right, institutional churches struggle. They if there's ever going to be where you take the means and make that the goal instead of the end, institutional churches will do that. All right, so dress becomes more important than people in worship. Style of music becomes more important than people in worship, or connection to God. And it doesn't mean, and we do a terrible job of explaining it. What the reason why you dress up, or you did dress up to go to church, because it came out of a society that didn't dress that way 6 days a week.
You want to give your best.
Right, you had work clothes. Then you had church clothes. And your church clothes were better. Why? Because they belonged to God, for lack of better words. Right. It was a sign of reverence. It was a sign of respect. It was, and so, if you're going up into the temple to worship, you brought your best, your unblemished stuff. Okay? So the reason behind all that is fantastic, right? And it's well versed in Old Testament, New Testament theology. Or at least you can make some jumps, some analogies with that. The problem is when that becomes the end. All right? And so, what happens if someone can't dress that way for various reasons? Right, that it's not that big of a deal, okay? And so, all that goes into, that's sort of the history of why we have this rise of this whole deal. Part of it is megachurch. One-stop shopping. And, and the idea was if we created a place that is large enough to have its own sports, to have its own, coffee shop place and whatnot. And, and there's some that have been very successful for this, okay? There's nothing wrong with that. And they are responsible coming out of the 80s and the 90s for a mass of people being connected to God who have left and been gone for years. Now we're living in a time where we see the negative side of that. Not everybody can do megachurch, all right? And so, or what are some of the pitfalls of megachurch? Well, you can get lost, or it can become very superficial. And so, what was originally designed as a way in, and then the idea was a way in, and then to filter down into small groups where maturation of faith can take place, there's been a disconnect now. So, what do? The pendulum has turned back to where a lot of small churches have becoming the key, because people want to go to a place where they know everybody. All right? I mean, as compared to going to a church where, I can sit and not know a single soul and they won't know me and I'm just a number. All right? And so, what the great thing about all this, as I see it, is, the church has always had these ebbs and flows, okay? If you trust God to be the head of the church, and Colossians says that it is, God has a way of bringing us back from the fringes to the center. Now, you can't see that in a lifetime, all right? We can't, all right? I mean, what's the average age? 70, 76, 78, somewhere in that neighborhood. That's not long enough. All right? The statistical information that they say lifespan. Some are going to be bigger or longer. Some are going to be shorter. And don't argue with me. This is somebody else making these decisions. I was riding to work the other day and said that we're now living a month longer. And I thought, okay, I was listening to some report and I thought,
what does the church do losing these people that are going to be the minister at 45? How do they vet those people? When you got nobody to pick from, you can't.
Okay, well, all right.
You gotta let them be, right?
No, all right, no. Well, hang on. That's a question. I'll tell you what South Georgia's doing.
I mean, you got to give them. The universities have a tremendous amount of time and money
Right.
invested in that PhD.
Sure.
And they're going to vet him.
Right.
That guy's not going to. Those people aren't waiting now.
Well, there's two ways that has happened over, which is this we have seen, and I'll speak from the Methodist Church. I'm going to make the assumption that it's true in some other institutional places as well. So when the pool starts to shrink, okay, you start to let anybody and everybody in. We got to find some more inflow into the church, all right? Well, that could be good. That can be bad. You could sacrifice effectiveness for numbers, and that's true at any business. Okay, all right. That's what the Methodist Church did for a while. All right, and so that doesn't translate into growth. So what has happened over the last 4 or 5 years, and the recession has been helpful for this. We have firmed up the boundaries so that not everybody is going to come in. We're now going from, we don't want everybody. We'll make it work with a smaller pool because we want just the best and brightest. So now they've taken, I'm just talking about South Georgia, okay? So now the method of how numbers is not lower the bar for anybody and everybody just so we can get a person in the pulpit. It is raise the level, even if that's a smaller amount of people. And the churches, I'm going to say it this way, I do not mean it exactly like this, but since this is not in the script, I haven't worked on it. Some churches are just going to have to live into a different day. Maybe go on charges, maybe even close, and we'll redeploy the assets. All right? I mean, it sounds horrible. Just sit with it for a minute. I mean, it's not, it's what the church now is forced to change on some things. But what we're betting on now is not a smaller bar for people to come in so that we can have more people in pulpits. We're getting comfortable with the less amount in hopes that of better quality. And the churches that have historically been served and they've got 10, 15, 20 people, 30 people, they're now going to have to go back to earlier models of charges or whatnot, or be faced with the reality that says, sorry, you have X amount of time. If that doesn't work, you're going to have to merge or you're going to have to close.
I like that.
Mm.
It's nice that it goes that way, but with the non-denominational churches, they don't bet, nobody bets. I mean,
Well,
you can say whatever you want to about Joel Osteen. He makes a lot of money,
right,
right?
yeah.
Who did it,
His dad did. His dad did.
And he writes a nice book. That makes him so special.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't
I'm not sure he
do
wrote
it?
it, but that's okay. I mean, it's a...
I got a nice book too.
Well, all right,
But
okay, hang on.
Charlatan or anything, but there is a question mark for those kinds
Okay, listen, that's a fair question, because one of the things that happened in the early church is when you're not connected to a larger whole, what are some of the pitfalls? All right? I'll tell you what they are, because it's been proven throughout history. We will re-image first century heresies. All right? And it'll happen all over the place. All right? For instance, the prosperity gospel. All right? You mentioned Joel Osteen. Osteen fits heavy into the prosperity gospel. Whether you like it or not, okay? This is not me giving the label. I'm just quoting what others have said. And you've seen on a national level, conversation between people like Joel Osteen and people like Rick Warren, who are on different sides of the spectrum, but they're both of the same weight, okay, same influence. Prosperity gospel's been around from day one. This isn't something new. And what I mean, does everybody know what I mean when I say prosperity gospel? Prosperity gospel is if you follow God, God's going to make you rich. Yeah. Well, same thing. I mean, so it's not new. I mean, there were Marcion, one of the first heresies in the first century. Marcions came out of a family that was heavyweights inside the early church. Now, I don't mean like Acts early church. We're getting like, 100 A.D., 150 A.D. I mean, his dad was famous, good minister. And Marcion takes the reins, basically says, all right, Old Testament, that's God, the Father. New Testament, for the most part, at least Gospels, is Jesus. We don't need any of that anymore because now we live in the time of the Spirit, Paul's writings. And so under the auspice of the Spirit, we can reinvent Corinthians. I can do whatever I want because I've got the Spirit and you don't. And so, I mean, he did all kind of things. I mean, he had like about 10 wives and, would come and speak for large amounts of money and stuff like that. And so, I mean, what happened is the church said, hey, wait a minute. You can't categorize this stuff. It's all linked together. You can't, Old Testament, New Testament, they're linked together. And so what will happen is in some of the not all of them, some of what is considered to be non-denominational, they're not non-denominational. They just don't tell you what their allegiance is to. I mean, they're tied to something. It might be the Baptist church, it might be the Presbyterian church, or even the Methodist church. It is now, it's in vogue to not give your affiliation. We're not St. Paul United Methodist Church. We're just St. Paul. Does that make sense? I mean, that's kind of over the last 10 years, you've seen a lot of people do that. And so there are some new church startups that you don't know what their affiliation is, but the key leaders still keep it somewhat close affiliated to whatever the mother denomination is. Now, some are not. Now, the ones that are out in left field, I'll tell you, over time, they will reinvent. They're going to have some of the same issues that showed up in the early church. Because, I mean, the church is a beautiful and holy thing. What makes it holy is God. All right? And so when people get involved, that's why if you're looking for the perfect church, it does not exist. It never will exist this side. And because people are a part of it. And so, I mean, you get personalities, you get Corinth, okay? I mean, you get the Corinthian church all over again. You get vying for power, you get people rubbing each other the wrong way. For instance, how many of you have never had a beef with anybody inside the church? A problem, yeah. I mean, somebody rubs you wrong. I mean, well, what I mean is that, this is not nirvana. Does that make sense? I mean, there are people who can say something inside the church that can hurt your feelings. Well, instead of dealing with it, we get mad and bitter, or whatever. I mean, I'm just giving you some what ifs. And so that happens. And guess what? That's going to happen always. All right? Because we live in a church that is in need of God's grace and mercy. And the beautiful thing about the work of God is God can take a dysfunctional group, a dysfunctional person, a dysfunctional church, and can help it move into something that looks more and more like Him. But that doesn't mean there's not going to be just stuff in the church. I mean, inside the church there's brokenness. And so people are going to make bad decisions. They're going to say things. They're going to do things, and the temptation is to ostracize, to push away. They're liberal or they're conservative or they're this or they're that, and there's just we have a tendency to fight over that stuff, and we're going to be fighting forever, right? That's not enough of excuse to say pick up your tent pegs and go, because there's never going to be a church that's going to have it all together always. And you probably don't want that anyways. I mean, let God do that, all right? Not, we strive to be Christ-like, but that's what we strive to do. And, when that day comes to fruition, then, thanks be to God. There's the church is in transition. And we're going to be in transition for, probably, I don't know, I think probably for my lifetime. And I think it'll maybe into my children's lifetime, and then it'll start to, I'm looking for then, if I would be alive, probably some level of resetting and going from there. Some of that will be denominations have to reform. You mentioned dues and whatnot. I mean, a lot of the mainline denominations are very top-heavy. And so, where are disciples made? Are they made on the global church level, or are they made on the local church level? I mean, that's an argument that denominations are having. And
Catholic Church is in the middle of it.
well, yeah, but you've got
Rethink their
yeah, I mean, you've got that. You've got the issue around homosexuality and sexuality in the church. I mean, and that's every denomination is trying to figure that out. And so, I mean, there's all kind of things that are presenting themselves that become where the rubber meets the road on how the church will change or evolve or grow, whatever word you want to use on it. And there'll be some, they're on this side of the issues. There'll be some that are on this side of the issues. What would be great is that if we could, push pause for a bit and, come back 150 years and, look into 150 years in the future and see how it all gets processed out. At some point, the early church had to figure out, what are we going to do with meat offered to idols? I know we're going to stop and just say, what are we going to do with the Gentile problem? All right? Got people that don't look like us, don't act like us, they don't follow the same patterns. What do we do? We let them in or we not? Well, they went through a time of prayer and discernment, said, we'll let them in. So anyways, take a break. No, ma'am, I'm fine. Listen, I don't need anything. I need to give up a lot. So, thank you, though. Okay, let's go ahead and come together. Right. That's where you see the real authority, you know. If it's all right, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the rest of the chapter pretty quick so that we can get through and try to get at least position ourselves for chapter 10. Going back to what Sandy read for us, beginning in verse 15, Paul regards ministry as a privilege. And it's not that he is trying to convince people not to get paid for their profession or a professional clergy or minister, but the idea or the hope would be, is that it's not strictly for the money. And so one of the questions that you can ask coming out of the text is your job a means for income or is it a place to live out your God-given giftedness? And that can also be applied to any profession. How do you see the whole role of occupation? Is it strictly for income, or is it, or can it be also a means by which you live out what the talents and the gifts that God has given people, and find a sense of fulfillment?
Don't you think because he came late, he had a career already probably in tent making? Isn't that what he did?
He did, but he's also part of the Sanhedrin. They got paid a little bit.
So he was fortunate in that he had some income.
Right. I mean, he chose to be bivocational, and tent making was a job that he could take anywhere with him. I mean, it was transferable. Part of his, if we go back to this, number 4 is where he would sit on the way that speakers would support themselves. For him, he felt that to be the best way because that would be the less taxing upon the church or on the group. And so for him, it was, part of it fit into his theology, part of it fit into how he operated in general. And so he argues from that aspect. Now, there are other apostles who did not. They're not, a number of the other apostles, to the best of our knowledge, did not have other jobs. They were supported by the church. And the scriptures aren't trying to weigh in, or this is my interpretation of the scriptures. They're not trying to say one is more important than the other. Two different means or methodologies of ministry. But for Paul, there's a sense of, if the less taxing you are on the church, the more freedoms you also have. And so, Paul could get up and go at the drop of a hat. If he was tied more towards the local congregation, then, obviously he's dependent upon that for his family, survival, things of that nature. And so you are dependent more on the institution, which then brings up the issue as a job, or as, the job of clergy. One of the things that, we ask of clergy, and it's a constant we ask of ourselves, is, where does it ever tip to where it's a job and you need it for the resources and not because it's a way of fulfilling calling? And, which each minister has to answer that for himself. I would hope that it's always, or at least the pendulum swings more on the idea that it is a way to fulfill calling. But, there are examples when that's not the case.
Even in the early Methodist Church, the ministers were paid so little that they actually depended upon the community.
Right.
I know my daddy had a store, and the preacher would come in and he'd give him his shoes and,
Right.
and his suits.
Oh, thank you.
That was just what you did.
Right.
For the,
Well, and you can, it's not, this is going to sound like I'm tooting a horn. I don't mean it this way. Comparatively, with graduate degrees, clergy get paid much less. The The Methodists get paid, they're not quite the highest paid ministers overall, but they're in the higher end. They're probably, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest denominationally and 1 being the lowest. They're probably around the 7 mark. There are some other denominations that just, just across the board pay more than Methodists. But I mean, like for us, this is public information. Most ministers start out at minimum salary, and minimum salary for the Methodist Church for an elder is $40,000. For a probationary elder, which is someone who's passed the first part of their board examinations, but then they have to go, they've got the second part still waiting to be tested on, that's about 36, 37. And then if you're on the front end of your examinations, you're around 32. And so going back to this, you got 45-year-old person who's got, 2.5 kids and a dog and a fish, and they relocated to seminary and they've got, 60 grand debt, at $32,000, they can't survive. And so that's one of the reasons why you don't have a lot of people going in the ministry anymore is, it's just, you can't do it. I mean, now, the good thing about the Methodist Church is part of the requirements is that the local congregation does have to provide insurance for ministers, so that they don't have to worry. I mean, the church covers the health care cost, but with the way health care costs, they might cover it for the minister. But if they got a family, I mean, you're still paying 12 grand a year, at least in premiums for insurance. I mean, you can do the math real quick. I mean, your income's $20,000, after insurance.
Does the conference help out ministers paying in any of these real small things?
They do. We have something that's called the equitable compensation. I actually chair that committee, and but again, this is the balancing of all the dollars and cents. Pre-recession, it's easier. We have a lot of money to help churches who can't. Post-recession, we don't. And so, just like any subsidies, whether it be on the church level or whether it be on the government level or state level, if the local group cannot pay, somebody has to pay for it. And so that comes out in the apportionments to all the other churches. There's a struggle there. So if the money doesn't come in, it's kind of living hand to mouth. So that number has decreased probably by about 65 to 70% in the last 4 years. And, so it is what it is. I mean, you only can go by how much you have. And, but we do support some churches that cannot support themselves. There's a time limit to it, and there are a number of restrictions that show up in order for someone to qualify. But we have a few churches, maybe about 10 or 12, that qualify in our conference. And South Georgia is a small conference. Now in other conferences, it's larger, and of course that amount would be more. But this is not a, and I'm not like trying to paint a bad picture, but that's just all that goes into the question of the pond, how big the pond is for ministers. And it's not just something that the Methodist Church is faced with. This is something that shows up everywhere. And Paul's answer to this, now this is a good question to ask. Paul's answer to this is bivocational ministry. But now the negative is, someone might be at work at this time. See what I'm saying? I mean, they might be working Monday, Friday, 8 to 5, so they're available on the weekends. But, if there are certain desires or expectations from a church, well, I mean, those expectations got to come down. I mean, you can't have someone... Right. So we like professional clergy here at St. Paul. So, I mean, on behalf of those that teach, so... They would, right, and so that's always been an answer, and that's one of the things that denominations now you're going back to, because of the cost factor for professional ministry, if that is waning or decreasing, well then you've got to find alternative means for the runnings and the growing of the church. And so you have lay speakers, you might have local pastors, which are people that have various degrees of education. They have not been to seminary. But they might have taken a few courses. They might be employed or deployed in areas to help. So there's a number of ways that they try to do it, but there's always a trade-off. I mean, I'm not trying to make a delineation between MDs and PAs. Okay, I think they're both effective, but there's sometimes you go to the doctor and you see what? You see the PA. There's sometimes you go to the doctor, you don't want to see the PA, you want to see the MD. Why? Well, because you need something a little bit more than maybe on an educational level than the other end, or maybe from a nurse to an MD or whatever. So that's okay. I mean, that's all part of it. The good thing about the church, and this is what Paul is getting at, is there are things that God has a way of providing, right? And it's whether it be in a methodology that Paul subscribes to. And he did it for a reason, so that it'd be less on the church. There'd be more freedoms. There'd be more things that could be used by the church. They didn't have budgets the way we do, but obviously if you don't have to pay, a salary and benefits, I mean, that's more money that could go out in the missions, And so there's a lot to this. He goes on to talk about how one of the things for him was that he felt by working his methodology of ministry that he would receive a great reward. That shows up in the scripture lesson that Sandy read to us. At the same time, when he speaks about this method of ministry, it allows him the ability to become all things to all people. That does not mean the idea of being hypocritical or two-faced, where you might be one thing to one person and one thing to something else. It's the idea of coming alongside somebody and being in relationship with them, that as y'all walk together, both grow in grace and mature in their faith. So one of the things that he is fighting against in the Corinth church is this sense of arrogance of the leaders that say, well, that's beneath me. Someone else needs to do that. I'm up here. You're down here, and so you need somebody down here to take care of whatever it is you need. I'm going to stay up here and do this part. And Paul's argument is, no, I can be all things to all people. One of the things that makes that easy for me is this method of ministry that I subscribe to. When we get into verse 24 through 27, it's a great way to end the argument. What's key here is there's no easy way to it. Regardless of what method of ministry someone subscribes to, it all requires self-discipline. And that's true of us, whether it be clergy or lay. And he gives some analogies that would be easily understood for the reader. Remember, the Corinthians had the Isthmus Games that were second only to the Olympics. And so, every some odd years, they had these huge sporting events that would take place inside the Corinth area. And so the understanding of what an athlete would have to do when it comes to self-discipline and training, they were fully aware of, well aware of that. And so he's taken that same cultural understanding, at least when it comes to athletics and to sports, and then applying that to your faith. Regardless of the means of ministry that you are part of, clergy, lay, professional or not, or lay just being deployed out into the community, all of it requires self-discipline. And we can never get away from that. To win the battle for Paul is to be self-disciplined, and the goal for him was to know Jesus Christ and to have him known, which would be true of all parties, regardless if they are clergy or not. So any comments or questions? I know we went through that real quick. Yeah, I probably should. I just ask him some questions out of the text. Should for professional clergy, should we work only for money? If so, what? That's kind of the issue of, is it more of a calling, or is it more of just a means for income? And then, should we not, should the Methodist Church go in and do bivocationals? And if so, what are the trade-offs for that? I don't have an answer to it, and it's an interesting conversation, and probably over time you'll see a melting of the two together, as trying to live in a society that has. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, there a number of them. I mean, there's some in Columbus, and some of them do very well, and so it's not something that is. Some of them are elders too. You know, they choose that on purpose. There's a good friend of mine. He actually thinks bivocational is the way to go. He can't yet because he's still paying for his 4 children's college education. But soon as he said he writes that last check, he wants to talk to his church about allowing him to go. So he's further along in that process than I am, so I'm just going to take his words for it. If y'all are, some of you are further along than he is, and you know a little bit more what that entails.
The expectations of the church, of the people
Yeah.
who belong to the church and what they expect.
That's right. I mean, a lot of it is local rules, and what I mean by local rules is that just as each denomination has its own culture, each local church has its own culture, and it's always wise to pay attention to that. And I mean, seriously, I mean, some of the biggest fights have come up inside of churches over that issue, and some churches would welcome that, but some would not. I mean, I don't think that would probably work here. But what's that? Yeah, well, y'all can take that up after I retire. So I mean, but there, normally in the larger churches it would not, because the larger churches operate more on a pretty, probably more like about a 12 to 15 hour schedule. Right, and so I'm not trying to argue job security. Okay, I don't want to. I mean, I don't want to be waving my flag that says, "Hang on, we're talking about it in theory." But a lot of it would be local congregations, and they would need to determine. And there are churches that Peter was very much a part of. He was not bivocational. A number of the apostles were not bivocational. So you can pick up the book of Acts, and you can pick up some of the non-canonical writings, which are non-books that did not make it into the Bible, but they give history, or they give some level of insight into what some of the other apostles were doing. They were not bivocational. Paul was. And so what, inside the, as I read this, inside the church is big enough to have both. It's not just a single cell methodology or paradigm for ministry. Both of them can be very effective. Any comments on 9 before we leave 9? All right. Is it? Going once? Twice? I don't have my gavel. All right. Move on into 10. Give me a second to get ready for 10. All righty. Chapter 10. We only got 4 slides, so that should be easy, right? All right. If somebody would, if you would read verses 1 through 13 for us.
Okay, warnings against idolatry. I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, what happened to our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. God guided all of them by sending a cloud that moved along ahead of him, and he brought them all safely through the waters of the sea on dry ground. As followers of Moses, they were all baptized in the cloud and the sea, and all of them ate the same miraculous food, and all of them drank the same miraculous water. For they all drank from the miraculous rock that traveled with them, and that rock was Christ. Yet after all this, God was not pleased with most of them, and he destroyed them in the wilderness. What'd you say, verse
13.
These events happened as a warning to us, so that we would not crave evil things as they did, or worship idols as some of them did. For the scriptures say, the people celebrated the feasting and drinking, and they indulged themselves in pagan revelry. And we must not engage in sexual immorality as some of them did, causing 23,000 of them to die in one day. Nor should we put Christ to the test as some of them did, and then died from snake bite. And don't grumble as some of them did, for that is why God sent his angel of death to destroy them. All these events happened to them as examples of us that were written down to warn us who live at the time when the age is drawing to a close.
you're standing strong, be careful, for you too may fall into the same sin. But remember that the temptations that come into your life are no different from what others experience, and God is faithful. He will keep the temptation from becoming so strong that you can't stand up against it. When you are tempted, He will show you a way out so that you will not give in.
All right, thanks, Joanne. Still has the same thought of this idea of overconfidence, this idea of arrogance, and so he's changing the argument now from, instead of talking mostly about his own self, now he's going to go back and look at some stuff that's tied into the Old Testament. So when we get in 10, the first 2 verses, or 4 verses, he mentions baptized, he mentions eating, he mentions drinking. What are they baptized into? What? Yeah, into Moses, in the cloud, in the sea, eating. All ate same spiritual food and drank spiritual drink. What did they eat and drink from? The rock. All right. So it's interesting here. Is that really what happened if we were to go back and look into Numbers and into Exodus when the children of Israel, the Hebrews, were leaving Egypt and going into what we call the Promised Land and following under Moses? Did they eat and drink from the rock? Were they baptized? I'm asking. Test your Old Testament knowledge.
Well, they went through the Red Sea.
Yeah, they went through the Red. Okay, they did. All right, so they journey out. Well, we don't have a big enough map. All right, so. Whoops. Well, doesn't want to move, does it? So this is the Mediterranean. This is Promised Land, Egypt, modern day Israel. They come out sort of like this, and then they go out over here for a while, and eventually they come back in like that. And all this is 40 years or so. And so this is water, Mediterranean. And but they're outside of, now you mentioned baptized as in going through the sea, but baptism in this day meant the rite of baptism, the actual baptism, the either pouring or sprinkling or immersion. Did Moses ever baptize anybody? You sure? Oh, you're right. He didn't. And did they eat from a rock? All right. What's manna? Right. Well, a lot of people think quail, which is why I'm a big fan of quail hunting. And now manna, the Hebrew word for manna literally is, what is this? And it's some type of substance, maybe a protein shake or something. And but it wasn't a rock, correct? All right. Did they drink from a rock? Okay, they did drink from a rock. They actually, but was that considered later on? Is Moses commended for drinking from the rock, or is slapped on the wrist? Yeah, slapped on the wrist. I mean, everybody's complaining. I'm thirsty. Moses is angry, takes the staff, bangs it down. This is Moses going on the trip across country in the car, and can we eat, Daddy? And it's like, all right, I've had enough. Bam, drink, So they, that's what that's like. And but there's not baptism. They're eating and drinking. The only one that you can make a case for is this one of the rock. But the rock is just some rock, right? It's like a boulder. He splits it open and there's water that flows out of it. All right. Okay, hang on. All right. So y'all getting another star. All the overachievers, y'all got it. So So the idea. Paul is doing something here that he is reinterpreting the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus. Right, exactly right. It's allegory. And the rock for Paul, he's reinterpreting that as not the rock that they drank from, but the rock Christ. And you can go back to the New Testament, the cornerstone. The building would be, first laid brick. So it's interesting here. This is something that is practiced in the New Testament all the time, where some of the New Testament writers, the book of Revelation does this a lot, where it'll take an Old Testament story or an Old Testament symbol and it'll reinterpret it through a New Testament understanding. All right? Does that make sense? And I just wanted to point that out to you, that even Paul, it's not just the prophets, who do this, or it's not just some of the gospel writers who do this. This is common, okay? And it's not like people are fudging or they're trying to redact something in history. It's not. This is just a common practice of, Sunday we talked about this in the Psalm 40 text, okay, where the psalmist is in dire straits and he prays and he cries out to God. God shows up, reveals Himself, and the psalmist is changed in every sense of the word, so that everything he sees in his past and everything he sees in his future is from that one event. Does that make sense? All right. Did y'all get that from Sunday? All right. Good answer. So if not, it's online. You can go and watch it again. And so you got the same thing here. This is what Paul is doing. Paul is saying, because of Christ, you're able to go. I mean, he goes back and pulls out a story in the Old Testament, and they would know about it, okay? And reinterprets these things, okay? So you've got baptism. What is also eating and drinking Christ? There you go. Good job. So y'all just all on it now, let me tell you. And what he's doing is he's setting up this as an argument, because later on in 10, what's going to come into play is if you have been baptized into Christ, holding concept of Lord's Supper, communion, and then all of a sudden it comes up to idols, where you were given the opportunity to do the same thing, doing this with Christ. Remember, this is just the Greek symbol for Christ, and doing this for idol. What might you be doing? Would you be linking the two together? All right. Right. So I mean, yeah. And so what? When we get into, I don't think we read it yet, but when we get into parts of 10, he's going to say, "Don't do it," because what you could be doing is linking something that's holy to something that's not. All right. And so, but if you miss this, you might miss this. Does that make sense? Maybe, maybe not. I got cloudy looks. We just tired, ready to go? I mean, it's raining, want to take a nap? I mean, but I mean, that's sort of what's going on in the text. Children of Israel, they come out, they're baptized in the Moses. God cared for them, spiritual food, spiritual drink, and keep on going. Now, these things occurred as examples to us so that we might not desire evil as they did. And then he talks about, verse 7, do not become idolaters as some of them did. And you can get out some of your Old Testament and find where they did that. They would have this experience with God, and immediately they would do things that would be forms of idolatry. I mean, what happens as soon as Moses comes off the mountain with the Ten Commandments? What's going on? Right. I mean, they didn't want to go into the promised land. There's all these giants. They're even spying on the people. Can't go in there. 10 Commandments with Moses, Aaron, and the golden calf. They would end up mixing with the Moabites and the Midianites, Numbers 25. And so what was constantly before them, at least in this period, is this temptation to be idolatrous. And the Corinthians are faced with a temptation that is similar to that. And so by calling on and drawing from the Old Testament as seen through the experience of Christ, he's trying to help this congregation to not do the same things that showed up in the Old Testament. And we do that today because there are all types of temptations that can present themselves, that even though they didn't happen exactly like that in the Old Testament, we can look through the lens of Christ and make the same types of conclusions, correct? I mean, there are. You've heard me say the difference between the ancient world and the modern world was that the ancient world was more honest when it came to gods. They just had temples everywhere. You know, we might have a church on a corner, but there are 1,000 temples that present themselves inside of a person's life, and we worship them all the time. And what would be some? Money. Prestige, power, football. Wait a minute now. Who said that? You don't get a star anymore. Let me erase that, you know. So that's only seasonal. So, you know, 9 months out of the year, we're all holy. The 3 months, we got a little bit of issues going on. But, I mean, what's that? Oh, yeah, there are a ton of them. We could make a list of about 50. And you could actually, if you got out some type of Greek mythology and you looked at the god and goddesses, I mean, you could easily find the equivalent. They just had a name for it. We just don't talk about it. But they still present themselves. And so the lesson for us, same lesson for the people in Corinth, you know, are we overconfident or arrogant to think that they're not going to bother us? Oh, somebody, not me. That's not a temptation for me. That might be a temptation for you, but it's not for me. That's exactly a good example. I can quit. Have you ever heard that? I could stop anytime. I just don't want to. Really? Okay. I mean, I've heard that 1,000 times. And, eventually I'm going to, but I just need to do it for X amount more. All right? So, this is real. Okay? And the temptations that showed up here and in Corinth also show up inside of our life. But here's the good news, and we're going to end on this. You get down to verse 13. Verse 12. So if you think you are standing, watch out that you do not fall. Notice that there are temptations, and they'll be vying for your identity. Okay? It's not just, I'm going to go and do something. I mean, Genesis 3 is the real issue. What ultimately will be your God? You, something else, or will God be your God? Verse 13, no testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and He will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with testing will also provide a way out so that you may be able to endure it. What's interesting is that Paul says that for the Christian, you're not spared temptation. I mean, to me, I didn't really know what temptation. I mean, when I became a Christian, when I started having temptations. When I wasn't a Christian, I didn't have any temptations. Well, you become a believer, all of a sudden you realize, whoa, all this stuff's in play. And so, but nobody's spared it. All right? God is not the author of it. That's just the world we live in. But with temptation, there's a way out. Now, there's a Greek word here that's really important. It's called ekbasis or ekbisis. John probably knows how to pronounce it better than I do. But the idea is that it means a way out in a mountain pass. So you got to see the imagery. You're climbing a mountain, and you don't, just imagine you're climbing a mountain, it's stormy, you don't know what you're going to do, and then all of a sudden you look, you don't see a way out, and then eventually you look, and there's a pathway, like a secret pathway to get out of it. That's the image here. And so the best way I know how to tell you this is from my own experience. You're tempted with something. And so in your mind, you go look at the book of James, I think first chapter, maybe around verse 12 or so. It doesn't have a fishing lure word in the Greek, but that's what it says. You are lured by it. Almost the way, throw a fishing lure in the water, the fish sees it, and it looks good to the eye. So you're considering, should I bite it? All right? James goes on to say is that, you're lured, you consider it, you bite it, follow that all the way down, it eventually leads to death. In that whole process, before you bite it, there will always be a way out. All right? The way I've experienced that normally comes, to me it's the voice of the Holy Spirit. Don't do this. You know how this is going to play out. Don't do it. And it's sort of like, if you want another analogy, stoplights. Sometimes the voice is a red light, and you know not to go. Sometimes it's a green light. Go ahead. Sometimes it's yellow. The ones that we struggle on are not the red and not the green. We struggle on the yellow. And but if you are unaccustomed to hearing the way out, when you are enticed, I mean, work, self-reflect, self-discipline from the last chapter, slow it down. Take a minute and consider something else. I guarantee you'll hear the voice that says, be careful, Shane. You know, and maybe what happens is your thought process slow for a minute, and you're able to see, different, here I am, here's what I want to do. Maybe the voice says, well, if you do that, it's going to play out this way, and that's going to be bad news. Maybe the voice says there's something up here. Maybe the voice says run from it. I mean, there's all kind of things. Most of the time when this happens, and I think you're aware of what I'm talking about. Most of the time when this happens, what we want is not even to consider the voice. Okay? And then just be careful. If there's ever a scripture that's true, it's this one. There's always a way out. In the end, it's whether or not you want to choose it. And that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's an identity thing. That's a heart issue. And so when you make those decisions where you blow right through the voice and you just keep on going and you end up just making a mess of it, use that as a case study to go back and reflect on the steps along the way, so that you train yourself to recognize where those pitfalls are, and they'll show up around issues of unresolved things in your life. Okay, I mean they will, and so if you want to allow God to help you with this in the long term, sooner or later you're going to have to deal with those unresolved things. Does that make sense? That's from my experience in my own life. That there's not a lure on something I don't care about. You understand what I mean by that? All right. It's not a lure if I've got the strength to do it. The lure shows up where I don't have it, and that's where it's enticing. And if James is right, and I think he is, if you play that out, it doesn't lead to desired end. It normally leads to brokenness. I heard a preacher say it this way, and I wish I could go back and I wish I wrote it down. Said, it'll always take you longer than you want to go, and to places you never wanted to be in the first place.
Sin takes you further than you want to go, keeps you longer than you want to stay.
Right.
And makes you pay more than you want to.
Exactly right.
And
Yeah.
it's all done with.
Yeah, I figured it was. I mean, that's obviously we were in the same. Norman. I don't know if you know. Norman has some great. I'm going to say one-liners. It's more than one line, but he has some really good, just core sentences that really sum up. But that's true. Well, you have to look at Pat. Yeah.
Sin will carry you further than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you more than you want to pay.
Right.
Different Darwinism.
Mm-hmm. Takes you takes you further than where you want to go, keeps you longer than you want to stay, and costs you more than what you want to pay. Yeah, that's right. That's true. Say what now? Oh yeah, I'll give it back to her. Okay. Yeah. All right. So. Yeah, we God giveth, God taketh away, God giveth again. So, all right. Any comments or questions? We're going to pick back up in after verse 13. The reason why we're going to pick up on 14 is because that's where the natural break is. Some of your Bibles will start with therefore, or it'll start with so that, and that's always a connecting from what just happened. Now, what does that mean? What's the causations of that? So we're going to start on verse 14 next week. Any comments, questions before we dismiss?
We need it repeated again.
All right. Sin will take you further than you want to go, will keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you more than you want to pay. All right, that's Norman Dunlap. Let's give the credit to Norman. Norman gets a gold star. So All right, go in peace. May the Lord be with you.